So yeah, the floor is open, and are there any questions? Yes, Yuri, please.
Yeah, thank you very much for this interesting panel. I have a lot of questions, but I will ask one. Dr. Professor Westermann, you mentioned about alcohol addiction, among this circle of assessment. I think the same stuff I met in circle of Ukrainian policemen during Nazi occupation as well. And also it reminds me of this movie Der Untergang, when Fegelein takes drugs, last days of the Reich and so on. So my question is, was it popular, and do you have any cases when SS manner had this drug addiction, when they take drugs, and how it was the reaction of their superiors? Thank you.
Yes.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah, maybe I can add another question from my side if there are no others now, and then we can, I think, answer them together. Well, I was a little bit surprised with all presentations, or that the question of anti-Semitism did not appear at all, or in the presentation of Professor Williams only as a kind of secondary context, and rather not as a driving force in the Holocaust. Yeah, maybe you can comment. And in my opinion, I think we lose a lot of I think it's an important factor, especially when we look at these what happened in the second half of 1941 in the occupied Soviet territory, where this motif of identification of Jews with the Soviet elite, with Soviet rule, is I think a very key factor for understanding what happens there, and also for the action of the killing units. Yes, maybe you can comment on that. Yeah, maybe you can start with Professor Westermann.
Yes, thank you so much. I believe that was Yuri Radchenko that asked the question. I can't see you, Yuri, but thank you for your question on drugs. Obviously, Norman Ohler's book, in English, Blitzed, looks at the use of Pervitin or methamphetamine by some of the perpetrators and tries to establish a causal linkage. What I found very interesting in my research on alcohol is two things I would stress. Alcohol was neither necessary nor sufficient for the Holocaust. It would have happened without it. But one of the other things that I have not come across one document by Himmler, someone who documented everything, where he talks about use of Pervitin or drugs being a problem or even an issue in the SS. Now, there are multiple orders that I have found where he is prohibiting the use of alcohol. So he's very much talking about alcohol, but Pervitin doesn't come into play. And with respect to Kai Strube's comment on anti-Semitism, I think this is a good point. In my first book, Hitler's Police Battalions, I look at ideology and organizational culture, which also ties to some of the discussions that Tim Williams was talking about, that sets these boundaries for behavior. And I do believe it's an important factor. And where we see this especially is in acts of rituals of humiliation against Jews, and also rituals that are aimed at articles of Jewish faith. So rituals that are aimed at rabbis, that are aimed at individual Jewish men, that are aimed at Torahs, that are aimed at the artifacts of the Jewish faith as well. So I think that that's very complementary to the discussion that I talk about. Thank you.
Thank you for the question, Kai. I think that the question of anti-Semitism is absolutely central to understand what happened in the East. Of course, But in the narrative the SS leaders developed after the war, but also in the war, the anti-Semitism was a kind of product of the ideology, and it was diffused in the discourse with kind of hidden words. So when Philbert said that he acted like a soldier, it's anti-Semitic, of course, because there was no war against the Jews. If you believe that there was a war against the Jews, then you believe that the racial determinism was shaped your view of the world. So the anti-Semitism is not always very clearly expressed, but it's everywhere.
I think I'd like to agree with that. You said that I argued that anti-Semitism is not a driving force. I think I would disagree with that. What I'm saying is that it's not necessarily always a motivation, or it's not necessarily even a key motivation, but it's so important for understanding this, how the world is seen, how the situation is read by the individual perpetrators, and thus as a facilitative factor. Just because it's not necessarily a necessary condition for participation, that doesn't mean it's not very, very important for understanding the general context in which it's happening. Yeah. So I would say ideologies, when I started this research, I had a much more sort of pushing back attitude towards ideologies and saying that they were maybe less important. And I definitely have moved away from that stance and do say that ideologies are very important, but it's key to understand what role they play precisely. And at the individual level of the perpetrator perspective, I do think that it's more in framing understandings of the world and legitimacy of the actions.
Yes.
I would like to raise a question for both. I would like to know, you study the killers, I think I know Professor Ingrao since long time. Since long time you study that, and it seems you study also in Cambodia. Do you see a difference? Because my question is, when people cross the yellow line, when they begin to shoot the first one, is it a difference between a basic shooter with like a Waffen-SS or a Polizei or a soldier, or somebody with high rank and finally gives the first order? Because I work in Iraq now, and we see how people begin suddenly to go to kill the first one, but the leaders of ISIS who kill nobody themselves and gave the orders. It's very, so do you see how people cross the line, how they pass from a normal human, say, to a killer, the first one?
Maybe I'll go first on this question. I definitely see a difference. I must say that most of the research, all the research I did in Cambodia was on low-level perpetrators. So I was only speaking to the Khmer Rouge at the low and mid levels. So I don't have any insights from my interviews. But from the broader literature, I would definitely say that there is a difference in terms of the kinds of motivations that drive people to, within positions of power and making decisions of extermination, to actually participating in it. Just as there's a difference between beginning participation, like you said, the first kill is going to be differently motivated to the 100th kill because of processes of normalization, processes in which you cognitively can disconnect from the acts that you're doing in ways also that the higher leadership do that. So I would completely agree with your assessment.
As for the Einsatzgruppen, I would say that there is a difference. The people in the Einsatzgruppen until the rank of Hauptsturmführer captain, they kill, and they kill almost on a daily basis. So from the rank of Hauptsturmführer captain till colonel, the people kill. But it's they kill one time or two times or three times. It's to give the example to the crews, and after this, they don't kill with their own hands. And the difference seems to me to be a rather functional one. The people the officers that kill seem to my advice, seems to be as ready as the other ones to do that, but they don't have to, so they don't do it.
Yes, Professor Westermann, maybe you can also add to this question. Yes, Professor Westermann, you can also think, yeah. Do you think that was
yes, I would just say that I agree with Christian Ingrao. I think his answer to that is perfectly along the lines of my own research with respect to the Einsatzkommandos.
Yes, other, please.
Okay. Thank you so much for very interesting and useful panel. But I wish to make one comment. Almost 30 years I work for human rights in the whole world. And I am here because my grandparents, my close relatives are killed in Babi Yar. I visited many times Cambodia. It's a wonderful country with serious, terrible problems. But you know, it's very, very complicated to talk about table, about differences, about similarities. So sorry. It's my short comments. Please, we are here for talk about tragedy in Babi Yar. Thank you so much.
Yes.
Thank you. I have a question for Professor Westermann. I was fascinated to hear how you spoke a little bit about maybe not the universality, but at least the commonalities between the carnivalesque aspects of genocides between, you know, the Red Army in the Civil War, the Nazis in the Holocaust. I was wondering if it's possible to draw any sort of ideological distinctions within how the carnivalesque aspect plays out, because I feel, for me, the sort of descriptions of, you know, some of the Einsatzgruppen, you know, and the leaders and their staff out on picnics and sort of safari hunting trip-esque things struck me as quite a sort of elitist image, a sort of hierarchical image, and I wonder if there's any ideological factors we can read into that. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for that question. To continue with that discussion, I think we can look at other examples, like in Rwanda, for example, which I talk in the book about, where we see this celebratory ritual, these post-killing barbecues, the exchange of the victim's clothing, for example, that takes place. And I believe, you know, from my earlier work, I do think that ideology is a motivator, and I know that Tim Williams talked about facilitator. I think that's an interesting choice of phrase, because I think alcohol facilitates also this kind of process. So I do think that it's important to keep ideology, because it's the matrix that forms the justification for the actions. And absent that matrix, a lot of the justification would kind of drop off. And where I think it's really interesting, and I didn't have time in my paper, I had a section on music and the incorporation, for example, of music and song into these actions. And again, group camaraderie and the way in which the songs are sung, what are the words of the songs, we see this throughout the Nazi period, from the stormtroopers into the killing fields. I think that those are the kinds of ways we can get indirect or implicit insight into the mindset of the perpetrators. And many of those songs and many of those activities are tied to their own anti-Semitic beliefs, to get that back to Kai Struve's earlier question. Thank you.
Yes, Professor Pető.
Thank you very much for this fantastic panel. And I would like to ask a question to Tim, asking to make a connection. Father Dubois started with this quote of recent experience seeing the Mein Kampf in Iraq. So I was wondering if you, from your model, if you see any transfer of previous know-hows and how these different framings actually influence the following genocides, and how this can actually enrich our understanding of motivations, reasons, and framings. Thank you.
Yes, I think we have another question by Father Dubois, and I think we can collect the last round of questions and then finish with our discussion. Yeah, the microphone, please.
Concerning the last question, it's a real problem, because I studied the attack of ISIS about the village of Yazidi or village of Christian. The strategy and the practice, the ideology is completely different. The strategy is very similar, but we don't know. By example, they block the village, they lie, they say go to the administration, no problem, put a white flag, we'll give you a new ID, don't worry, etc., etc. They make a deal with the neighbors, but it's not the fact that we find 5 books of Hitler in the bookstore that it means there is really affiliation. But we cannot say also there is no affiliation. It would be something to be studied at high level in the topic of the leaders of ISIS or Al-Qaeda. Hitler is a model, but I don't think a chief of ISIS is reading the report of the Anzas group to know what to do with the Yazidi. But there is a similarity. The other question I would raise to the professor is that they use narcotic a lot in ISIS, but they use it when somebody doesn't want to work. By example, when they send a special commando of killers, we have many testimonies of two killers who don't want to kill, so they give them pills by force, and after they are happy to kill. Also, for suicide bomber, when a child refuses to be a suicide bomber, they give him pills, and he's happy to go. So pills seems only to be used when people don't feel so happy to die.
Yeah, I think there were, would you like to start?
Yeah. Yep, I can start. Thank you for that question. I must say I don't see strong degrees of learning between the cases that I've studied. I think this is, I mean, particularly in Cambodia, the people who are responsible for the genocide studied in Paris, and there was certainly transfer of ideas in terms of what constitutes an ideal communist society. There was a lot of transfer of knowledge across Asia and Southeast Asia in terms of Maoist principles and so on. In terms of the larger context is definitely influenced by peers and by other ideas. But at the very local level that I'm interested in, I don't think I can really see very much of that. At the same time, I do argue that they're all very strongly interconnected, and the way that the society and structures of denunciation, for instance, were created impacted very strongly on the social realities of the perpetrators who I was interviewing. And so there was definitely a degree of impact in how that would structure motivations. I do think that in general, I mean, it's a good sign that there's not too much learning between cases, and that maybe the sort of the scientific engagement of genocidal regimes with the state of the art is maybe not where it is in terms of learning in how to motivate people, and long may that last.
Yes, okay, one last question, and then I think we should finish our discussion.
Yes, this is also for, first of all, I enjoyed is probably not the right word, all 3 of the presentations. I found them fascinating, so thank all of our speakers. Tim, I was utterly fascinated by the models that you did, and of course, everyone in this room has been working on some sort of genocide or some sort of mass murder, and so we all plug in the models that we have. My time has been spent in the 1990s in Yugoslavia. So obviously I was looking at some things, and one of the first things I was thinking about in your model, would you have the outgroup influence, I think it was. In ex-Yugoslavia, which was a country that in the smaller towns, many people were not terribly literate. They got everything from television. And you had people who were Serbs, Croats, and Bosniaks all living in the same town, and for dozens and dozens and dozens of years. And it was basically through media coming out of Belgrade and Zagreb that told them that their next door neighbor was actually a Turk. They didn't know he was a Turk. But once that they were told that he was A, Turk, and B, was going to kill them, then they felt justification in rounding them up, taking them away, and actually shooting the whole family. So what I'm wondering, I like the model very much, and it's not a criticism at all, but I think there's such an interesting way where, let's say, if in a hierarchy, where the outside influence takes even precedence before you get to those the others could then be justifications or motivations once you have that outside ideology. The second point is, just to bring it up, is several years ago, Jonathan Steinberg wrote I think one of his masterworks called All or Nothing, Alles oder Nicht, the Axis in the Holocaust, in which he compared German troops and Italian troops in 5 theaters of war, almost all of them in the Balkans, of course, where they both were serving. And what he did is he compared actual documents, letters back and forth between military commanders, where in so many cases, and not all, but in so many cases, when the Italians had the chance to act like humans, they did. Whenever there was an opportunity for the Germans to act human, they didn't. And at the very end of the book, at the conclusion, he says it doesn't do any good to do stereotyping of people, but there are national characteristics. And he says that what we have in what Germans respect are obedience, respect for authority, and he listed 2 or 3 others. And he said, what is the national characteristics of Italians? Cynicism, disrespect for authority. He said, with Germans, when you put a national ideology on top of that, you have trouble. With the Italians, when you put a national ideology on that, you have what was Mussolini's great quote. He says, the problem in Italy is there's only one fascist. Of course, that wasn't true, and we know that, and there were quite a few people who were killed. So what I would like to do is just give you that information and hope that someday I can see another presentation so that you can use these models, because I was utterly fascinated by what you did.
Yes, so, thank you very much for this comment. I think I forgot, there was one question to Professor Westermann that we had not yet answered. If your question, forgot, was your question? The man in the back, yeah, you had a question to Professor Westermann that had not, where he had not yet the occasion to react on, yeah? So, please, Professor Westermann, you. Well, I think I've already answered that. Yeah, no, the
Professor already answered.
He had not yet answered, I think, yeah? Yeah.
I think
okay.
I think I did answer.
So
yes, thank you.
Okay.
I appreciate that.
So yeah, would you like to comment on this last remark?
I'll very briefly respond. Your first point about the media and the creation of the outgroup and the definition of who various groups are and what it means, I think is very important. And I would see this as within the model as part of the contextual conditions. And this resonates down into who is even seen as the in-group, who is seen as the outgroup, and then it can unfold its social psychological mechanisms. On the second point that you made, I'm a little bit more hesitant. I think that, of course, socialization processes, cultural reference points are very important, and they do structure the way that individuals will see their options in terms of what kind of action can they engage in and what does this action mean. But there's also strong degrees of differences within larger cultural groups. So I think these more culturalist explanations that argue that the German obedience, etc., I think I'm more hesitant in adhering to.
Yes, thank you very much for these 3 very concise and impressive papers and for the interesting discussion. I think we should finish now with this panel, and then I think we will meet in about, have lunch and meet in
dear guests, we will have lunch now in Altruist Restaurant. Our hostess will guide you, so you're welcome.